You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Achieve the dangerous freedom you dream of in your lifetime. You're listening to On the Run with Runzo W. Martinez.
All right, folks, welcome to the show. Welcome back. It's been a while since we've spoken to Caleb Franz, host of Profiles in Liberty. He is literally speaking to us from his underground bunker in Kentucky. You think I'm joking? Like I usually start off a little bit sarcastically, but you're in an underground bunker. You found a secret room in your new house, and I mean, it doesn't give me Oklahoma City vibes. But I mean, tell me again. When they were giving you the walkthrough, did they say, "Oh, you've got a secret room," or did you just stumble upon it and the realtor was like, "Yeah, I totally knew that was there"?
Definitely the latter. It was a pleasant surprise because, as you pointed out, this is much better of a setup for recording and doing things like interviews, at least audio interviews, maybe not video, but doing things like this for recording purposes as well as. I don't know. I've been thinking about possibly setting up a brew station downstairs in this room to see where we can what contraptions we can make.
You're gonna put a poster up at least, right? Like something on the walls.
Single poster.
A single
Yes.
poster. I just found out that Jeffrey Dahmer was in Milwaukee, and that this is where he did all his gay cannibal stuff.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Very fun.
And I found out
lighthearted stuff. Yeah.
You know, just Barney and rainbows here.
Mhm.
So when you turned on the camera and I saw that, it immediately reminded me of the basement in Jeffrey Dahmer's grandma's house where he killed 3 people. So, you know, I just finished that series on Netflix, and that seems to be the only thing I think about. I realized that every day I used to drive to work going into Milwaukee, I passed by the site of his old apartment. So where, you know, the other 13 occurred. So it's been top of mind, but I bet you'll get your secret Unabomber room in tip top shape very soon. But speaking of home brewing, you've got a recent article out, folks. I'll go ahead and link to it in the show notes, basically making the argument that if you can brew beer at home, you should be able to distill whiskey. I want to talk this through because I didn't think that I would be on a different page than you on this, and I don't think I am. I just think I haven't really thought about it. So the homebrew movement has really blown up the past 10 years since more and more people are actually able to access the ingredients, access the tools they need to start homebrewing. A lot of people are able to do it in even relatively small spaces. When you made the argument for distilling whiskey, and let's go as far as bourbon, gin, other stuff, that I started wondering about, because growing up in the South, you hear a lot about the copper stills and things like that, the old moonshiners. And the one thing that did kind of catch my attention is that a lot of those folks like would blow things up. So this is one of those rare situations where I'm wondering, is there a limit to what you're cooking and brewing in your home? Because maybe I just need to touch up on it a little bit, but let's rewind a little bit. Talk to us about your article. What's the case you're making, and where am I a little bit off?
Yeah, well, that is, I think, probably the most reasonable, case for to be opposed to something like this. I think it's a little bit
very anti-explosion.
Yeah. Well, that's where we separate here.
Fair.
It's a little bit different, you know. The stills and the technology today are not the same as what they once were when these things were really blowing up. And throughout something that I noticed after I wrote this article was seeing how people, even in the Soviet Union, would distill their own liquors. And there wasn't really much of any stories about anything blowing up. There's always a risk of things much more than say, brewing beer, but it's I think a very overblown risk, and it's not necessarily something where prohibition or just a complete outlaw of the practice is the solution to. I think you can have safe practices with this without it resulting in a complete outright ban, because that's where we see ourselves in today. And you see a lot of people where this is kind of the catch 22 of this, right? It's obviously not illegal to distill spirits commercially with a permit. It's only illegal to do so in your home. So obviously that means that individuals who are in the commercial market can do so. Well, how do you get into the commercial market? You have to generally know what you're doing by getting a permit. Well, how do you get a permit? Well, you have to practice, and unless you can do so under the watchful eye of someone who already has all of this equipment and probably already has a license to do so commercially, then you're kind of out of luck unless you do so illegally, which is what a lot of people opt to do. In which case, we also don't really see a whole lot of explosions happening today, even though this is still, in fact, happening even to this day, where a lot of people, including a lot of distilleries and a lot of places that sell very popular bourbons today, they got their started practicing mostly illegally, and that's not something that I think really makes a whole lot of sense.
So are the laws that used to dictate whether or not people could homebrew beer, does it really cross over liquor? I know in different states and different parts of the country, beer and liquor are treated differently.
They are treated differently. Beer is pretty laxed right now as far as what, as laxed as any alcohol. It can really be considered lax, but like compared to what it was, especially back during the big craft beer revolution, whenever Jimmy Carter first legalized home brewing, and it sort of brought about this big wave of new industry and new enthusiasts and new hobbyists and people who just outright quit their day job and said, you know what, I'm going to go brew beer now. And it created entirely new industries. That is something that has flourished because it is a little bit different outside of the way that states and certainly the federal government classifies that. We're seeing a little bit of a growth in the distillery market recently, and that's in large part due to deregulation. We are seeing instances in which people are starting to realize that we can cut back on the regulations with spirits, but that fundamental threshold of where people can break into the market and be the ultimate disruptor, that still exists. And that threshold, I think, is ultimately whether or not people can practice and people can be hobbyists and enthusiasts inside their own home.
Right. So what are some of the immediate barriers that people are facing? Like, what are the arguments against allowing people to go ahead and distill gin and whiskey from their own property? Is it really just the old tax argument? I mean, everything ultimately distills down to that, no pun intended. Or is it just the general safety argument? Because I feel like now, even in the United States, what's weird is that we're not the teetotaling culture that we were prior to Prohibition. But I went to school in an area of Alabama where they still had dry counties and where you couldn't purchase beer or liquor on Sundays from Walmart or any other place. And then at some ABC stores, they even make it harder for small legal distilleries to go ahead and get on the shelves and stuff like that. So does it ultimately come down to a tax issue? What were some of the arguments against home distilling that you found doing your research?
Well, I found, there are several arguments. I wouldn't call many of them very good. I think that the safety argument is a legitimate argument. I don't think it holds much water whenever you get down really into the nitty gritty, and certainly not as an argument to outright ban it altogether. I think like I mentioned before, I think you can do something like that and have sort of safeguards to protect against that without it resulting in an outright ban. But there is at least something that you can point to there. But ultimately, it does come down to taxes. It comes down to what the government is going to be able to get out of it. And then it comes down to, I think, a little bit, people in the spirit industry wouldn't probably be as eager to bring about new competition. So they're not, they're not exactly eager to do that. I can't speak for all of them, obviously, so I don't know all of their motives. But if I had to say that, if I say like, hey, do you want this new person to compete against you? Well, probably not. So that is another major motive that a lot of people can step out against. But I do think that it makes sense for a lot of people if they that fear veil of like, oh my gosh, is this going to blow up in my basement? Once that's removed, I think that a lot of people don't really get it. If I'm just making it for myself in my own home, I have no intention to sell it to anyone else, and it's just something that I just want to keep to break out for parties and for gatherings and events and things like that, or just self-consumption. Why can't I do that? What's the real reason why I can't do that? And ultimately, it does come down to tax purposes, because government loves to make money off of spirits. It is an American tradition dating way back to the Whiskey Rebellion, as we know, and that is something that they're not too keen on giving up anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the safety goes, as far as the safety concerns go, I mean, I was joking a little in terms of, like people moonshining, but I mean, when you're dealing with moonshine particularly, which is where some of the arguments came when I did a little bit of Googling, I mean, you're dealing with like giant stills, you're dealing with a whole operation. Mm-hmm. If you're doing at-home distilling, it's going to be much smaller, much safer, much more manageable than if you're doing that, because it's more akin to, home brewing, which is largely safe, which is largely accessible. They take it seriously. My wife and her side of the family, they homebrew from their garage, which is great. But then you walk in and immediately your blood alcohol level spikes as soon as you breathe it in. But I mean, it's like if we're going to take the safety concern into it, I mean, I would argue that, deep frying turkeys around Thanksgiving has killed more people than anyone attempting.
Yeah, when was the last time you heard about a home distillery, an illegal, home distillery blowing up?
You don't. I mean, I don't think it's ever happened.
It just doesn't happen. People do break the law and do it. Don't get any misinterpretations about this. They definitely do, but it's much safer than it ever was. Generally, people who are getting into it have done their homework because they're enthusiasts and they just want to make whiskey. They don't want to blow up their house. They understand the risks involved in it. And there's really 2 points that I thought of when you were saying that. Really, this comes down to the basic fundamentals of prohibition. If something is driven underground, it's going to be made more dangerous by its nature of being underground, as opposed to being out in the open, being allowed to freely experiment and do things that it has to kind of cut corners and do things a little bit more dangerously if it were shoved to the shadows. So by nature of lifting the prohibition against home distilling, the safety argument becomes virtually non-existent. I think that there still can be, if it's really a big point of concern, there's still maybe some certain not regulations, but just some certain standards or guidelines to ensure people follow by. But that's not something that I'm really terribly concerned about.
So who are the big culprits here? Is it state level governments or is it the federal government?
It's both. It's ever since prohibition ended, it never really ended. Not in the way that it's just like completely free for anyone to do anything with alcohol. The government made sure that there were still loopholes in which it can interfere in the alcohol industry. Part of that was by ensuring that nobody could create beer, buy beer or liquor or wine for that matter, by themselves in their own home. Right. Well, that's great. Basically created a virtual monopoly for a lot of different industries in the alcohol industry. And at the end of Carter's administration, that ended for beer, but the prohibition against spirits is still ongoing to this day.
Where do you think the line separates how people treat beer and how they treat liquor? Is it because of different lobbying forces behind it? Because big beer and big liquor, people think they're the same, but they're largely different. And, it's much like how we classify drugs, how you classify beer. You're not going to really have the same standards for how you do that versus once you start getting into, harder distilling of liquors.
Ultimately, I think, there's a little bit of like fear that people can play on, and that kind of stuff works to a certain degree. But this is something where you can't really make as much tax money on beer as nearly as much as what you can on distilled spirits. And that's ultimately what I think it really comes down to, is that the government wants to be sure to, if we're going to consume, it wants all of the money it can get from us. If we're going to have any sort of liquor, and that is, I think, the crux of the argument, and it benefits a select few industries. It creates barriers for enthusiasts or for potential entrepreneurs who would otherwise disrupt the industry and would otherwise create a really dynamic marketplace, one that is currently facing a lot of changes and is being disrupted because of certain deregulations in the marketplace. But it could be so much more. It could be much more like the craft beer industry. And that to me is exciting because I love bourbon. I love my spirits as much as the next guy, as much as any Kentuckian would be anyway. But I think that there's a lot more that can happen, and I think that there's a lot more creativity and a lot more thoughtfulness and just combinations and formulas that haven't even been considered yet. Well, it could be in the mind of someone who just simply isn't allowed to experiment in their own home.
It's so weird because as I was reading your article, I was like, well, this should just be common sense. But it wasn't even until a couple of years ago in the pandemic where you had a lot of states who finally said, oh, if you want to go ahead and order alcohol with your takeout meal or for delivery, you can go ahead and do that. And in Virginia, one of the things that I thought was awesome, but also came with its own hangups, was that you could go ahead and order, order bottles of bourbon to be shipped and mailed to your home. Now you could only do it within Virginia, but I think Kentucky did it, Tennessee did it, West Virginia, Maryland as well. A lot of states seem like their neighbors started doing that. So you still can't order, Virginia whiskey if you're in West Virginia, which is ridiculous because at that point you're dealing with different states' laws regarding the transportation and consumption of alcohol, which is wild because as progressive as we have come, not just in terms of, our tolerance as a society towards alcohol. With everything that's come with drug use, you would have thought that alcohol would kind of jump into it beforehand. Now, am I equating the two? Kind of, sort of. I think a lot of people don't want to deal with that, but the truth is that people want to consume things. In Wisconsin right now, in Milwaukee, I think we have the largest number of breweries and bars per capita, I think, in the world. But we're also a state which, you look at our neighbor Michigan, and we still haven't legalized weed and stuff like that. We're just barely getting into the CBD market. We started putting, CBD vending machines in certain areas in the state. So it's weird because it's like here we have greater freedom in terms of what we can do with beer and liquor, but then we kind of go backwards on that. So it's one of those things where it's like, I understand that each state has to decide their own path. What do you think is the better solution for this? Would it be better to go ahead and start top down, try and eliminate federal regulation, or to try and convince the states, much like states were convincing each other during the pandemic, where you've got Abbott saying, you want to go ahead and order a margarita to go for it, man, and stuff like that?
Well, in this respect, it is a lot like marijuana in the sense that you have two tiers to this battle. It's a state regulation, or excuse me, a state prohibition as well as a federal prohibition. Now, what states can do, I don't think that they should wait until the feds get their act together, because that's going to be like watching paint dry. It's not going to be a very good use of their time.
Sectarian violence in the Middle East will end. The four horsemen will descend upon us. Cats mate with dogs. Elon goes to Jupiter.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that something that states can do in the meantime is actually something that a lot of states already have started to do, including my original home state of Ohio did this, I think, a few years ago. And that is simply to just create a trigger law for home distilling, is that if it becomes legal on the federal level, it immediately kicks in and overturns its state, and it's completely legal throughout the state. So I think that that's something that could be a really easy option. That if you don't want to get your hands wet right now or try to rifle any feathers, then the least that we could do, I think, is to create an environment to where once the federal government gets their act together, then there's no waiting for step two. It's just go. You can do it. It's easy. Well, it's not easy, but but you're free to go. And that is something that I think only 8 states have done at this point so far. So there's still plenty of room in this movement, and really, it I think just requires a lot of awareness on this issue, because not a lot of people are aware that this is even a thing. It's not a thing that people are hyper aware of.
Yeah, what got your interest in this? Is there a movement behind this, or I would think
to do it.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's an easy answer.
Yeah, like quite honestly, like I love the craft of alcohol, and I am constantly consumed with the history and just the craft of the trade, and the history of the industry, and of the fight between temperance and prohibition versus freedom, and the ability to go off, and what creativity might spur out from that. And I think it's an important one. And I love, beer and liquor as much as the next guy. I became quite quickly realizing that this is not something that is on the top of the mind of most people. As long as they have something in front of them, then it doesn't really affect them that much. But in reality, this is affecting the entrepreneur the most. This is affecting the small businessman, the person who might not even know that he or she wants to get into this industry because they haven't had the opportunity to get their feet wet in the first place. There is so much untapped potential because we don't allow people to experiment with these things. That should be the baseline. That should be the default. That shouldn't be something that we're begging the government for permission to simply try new things with.
I feel like you're right ahead of the curve on this one, because I was talking to somebody who's one of the investors at the brewery that I bought into this year. And what we're seeing is, like, for the past, let's call it 2 decades, the past 2 decades have been a craft beer revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, and it came from the South, and now it's going throughout the country.
And wine to a certain extent too.
Wine to a certain extent. I think more people who were like, if you got into beer, you were also checking out wineries while you were at it. But it's like there's more of a fascination with whiskey. And right now, what you're also kind of seeing is that now there's kind of like a renaissance with brandy specifically. And I think if any change is going to come with this, it's going to come with it from millennials, because millennials for the first time actually – not in terms of like the volume of whiskey or the like how whether or not they could afford really expensive whiskey, but in terms of the number one consumers of whiskey and bourbon in the United States, it has gone from the boomers, and now the millennials have picked it up, and that's only a very recent thing.
Yeah, I think this is going to pick up, especially when more and more people, because that is something. I mean, you have a great point there. Like, a lot of millennials were sort of leading the charge in the craft beer revolution, especially in that post 2008 financial crisis era where everyone lost their jobs and they were like, all right, well, I'm going to do this thing that I've always wanted to do. Now's the chance to try
Let's
it
make
out.
Beer.
We're kind of in a similar situation now in a post-COVID world. And I think that some of that will still go towards craft beer. But I think now people are really, really interested in getting into spirits, because there's almost an oversaturation of the craft beer industry at this point, where everyone knows that it's like, it's everywhere. It's hard to escape. Not that I'm trying to, but it's very prevalent. It's very, very voluminous. There's more craft spirits on shelves in stores than I've ever seen before now. And that's a great thing. And that's largely in part because there have been certain cuts and certain tax cuts in spirits and alcohol, certain deregulations that have happened over the past few years that have allowed this entrepreneurship to flourish. But there's still an entirely new world out there, to the extent of craft beer, that spirits have not even been permitted to break into yet. And I mean, you don't have something that people will really want to get into soon.
Yeah, I mean, I look at Ryan Reynolds with his Aviator,
with his gin,
with his Aviator gin, and then I look at The Rock with his tequila. And I mean, with that, you have two things. Like, gin was never really one of those things that a lot of people were buying. And then suddenly gin had a resurgence, I think, thanks to people that started getting into whiskey. I think once you start getting more millennials specifically into whiskey, eventually, and this is just a guess, but I think tequila is going to be the next big thing. I think, because tequila used to be, the party alcohol if you couldn't get, vodka, because whiskey was still one of those things that a lot of people kind of stayed away from. It was in your dad's shelf. It's what your grandpa drank. It wasn't fun. I think tequila is going to have a weird resurgence. And then I think eventually, if things in Mexico get better, because it's ultimately dependent upon Mexico, my big goal within the year, and I'm going to be taking another trip to Nevada in January. I want to try mezcal for the first time. And what I'm seeing amongst a lot of people who are in the beer business is that they're trying to diversify their reach into the whiskey industry. into the bourbon industry, into tequila at some point, and then mezcal. There's going to be a lot of money in mezcal because there are only a few places in Mexico that even make it.
Yeah.
I don't even know what it tastes like.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate. I think that I think that I mean, any sort of brewery that you find here in Kentucky where I am have already kind of set the precedent for that a little bit, because a lot of breweries double up as distilleries as well, which is great. You know, it means that a lot of it's very strong. A lot of the beers that you get are going to be very strong.
Everything's sitting in the whiskey barrels now.
Yeah.
That used to be a very rare thing. Now everyone is doing.
Now it's very prominent.
A crossover,
And, you know, God bless it, because I love a bourbon barrel beer. But yeah, I do think that more experimentation on that kind of stuff is going to continue to happen. But there's only so much that can happen before some of these laws actually get changed. But of course, it's not the slow turning machine of the legislature that changes things. They're reactionary. You know, they do things after there's already been a movement, after there's already been vocal outcry against these kind of things. So if it's going to change, it's really going to have to come to more public awareness, and it's going to have to come through more public outcry to demand some sort of a freedom of the spirits.
Well, Caleb, I'm going to go ahead and link to your article in the show notes today so people go ahead and read it themselves and share amongst friends and others who would definitely want to see this happening at some point. Could you imagine being the guy who, as you're trying to do, who can go ahead and say, hey, you want some of my homemade whiskey? Hell yeah, that's going to be fun. People want to have fun. People want to do that shit. If people want to go ahead and catch up with you and everything else you've got going on, how could they do so?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Caleb Franz, and my show Profiles in Liberty is wherever you get your podcasts from.
Folks, all that in the show notes and more. Caleb Franz, thank you so much as always.
It's a pleasure, Renzo.
Folks, go ahead and do me a favor. If you love the show, even if you hate it, actually scratch that. I only need the homies. If you don't like the show, fuck off at this point. I'm done. I'm done appeasing everybody. Go ahead and leave me a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you find the show across Al Gore's amazing internet. And we'll be back next Monday. As always, be safe, be good. Good night.